find the technique that feels good and then lean into how that looks on our body.
Yeah.
And tweak it, as opposed to picking how we want to look and then trying to find the technique that will get us there.
Yeah.
That is a recipe for madness. Hello and welcome to another zany episode of Nerdy West Coast Swing, the podcast with pixels where the anchors are out of this world and the points don't matter. We are here to help train your eye so you can learn faster and dance better. I'm Cassie Winter.
I'm Alicia Marshall. If you're wondering who are we to be analyzing these pros, Cassie and I both have extensive training and experience in both partnered and solo dancing. Cassie has about 24?
Yes.
And I have about 26. I had to calculate that in my head like right before.
It doesn't help that the last 4 years that we've been doing this has been an absolute blur.
Yeah, that too.
Time has lost all meaning.
Yep, pretty much.
We are doing something new tonight.
Yeah.
Because time has lost all meaning. We're tired. So we're doing a couple of Talking Heads episodes without a screen share. We might do a follow-up with a screen share to like demonstrate what we've been yakking on about. But yeah, we're just going to wax poetic about things for a while.
Yeah, pretty much.
Would you like to introduce our topic?
So we are talking tonight about quality of movement, and we're going to talk about a couple different things with it. We're kind of going to go over first, like, what is quality of movement, just generally, because that's a term that kind of floats around a lot. And I think that, there's a specific definition of it for West Coast Swing, and I think that there's a general version of it. And I think that we tend to use a more general version of it for West Coast Swing when we're talking about things, even though we probably should be looking more at a specific type of quality of movement. So go into that a little bit. And we have talked about this before. We have a couple different episodes that we kind of reference this. We haven't gone quite into detail as much with it as we're planning on going tonight. So we'll have a little bit more of a deep dive with a couple different aspects of it tonight.
Yeah. A silly analogy just came to my head. I feel like quality of movement is to West Coast Swing what umami is to food. You know, like unless you're like a connoisseur who really gets how to distinguish umami from other things, right? Like, I don't know. Is that terrible? Do I delete that when I go?
Want to? I mean, I get it.
You get it. Okay, cool. That means it's not just pure insanity in my own head.
No, I just wasn't expecting that particular comparison. Caught me off guard.
We did take notes, but still, a lot of this is off the cuff. All right.
Yep.
So, part 1, we're going to be talking about quality of movement in general, and then we're in part 2. So these are probably going to be 2 different videos for YouTube, but we'll record both of them tonight. We're going to be talking about quality of movement in West Coast Swing specifically. So, shall we dive into what on this God-given earth is quality of movement in general?
Yeah.
All dancing and movement.
I think the main thing when we're talking about quality of movement, what it should be is like really having control over your body and like how you're placing it, where you're moving it, all of that type of thing, and being able to control timing. But I think there is a more broad way that we use it where it's kind of, we're talking about like what's aesthetically pleasing and not so much about the control that we have and if we're doing things correctly in terms of West Coast Swing technique. So do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, so like the end result of the technique behind quality of movement is aesthetically pleasing movement in relationship to whatever dance style you're looking at, right? And the reason why we want to do a deep dive on it today is because we feel like it gets lost in translation a lot, that the technique needs to be the foundation of it. And then the reason why we're doing this in 2 parts is because there's general quality of movement and then there's quality of movement specifically to West Coast Swing. And in order for West Coast Swing to be aesthetically pleasing correctly, the technique needs to be correct. And there is a range of correct technique. This isn't like international Latin, for example, that has a very specific textbook definition of what that technique is supposed to look like. But I don't know. I feel like the range that is correct for West Coast swing is not being communicated clearly enough for a lot of people. So the range of aesthetically pleasing for the every person has gotten real big.
Yeah.
And so like I'll be watching dances at any level, it doesn't matter. And some things that I think are done really well, nobody cares about. And the things that other people tend to care about, I'm like, but that didn't actually look good. And it's because we have the context of the technique that's supposed to support the quality of movement. So that's the rant we're going on.
We just kind of want to talk about it because I think it is kind of confusing because people use it in such a broad sense. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of newer dancers that come in and have good quality of movement in general because they have other dance experience. But that doesn't mean that their quality of movement is equal to what it should be for West Coast swing specifically. And, you know, we can talk about like more old school West Coast swing versus more modern West Coast swing. And I think that that also affects that kind of range of acceptable techniques. I think that because we are, you know, moving into the more modern West Coast swing and whatnot, like some of the foundational things are a little different. And so I think that kind of affects the range. But I think in general, there's still certain things to look for. It's just there's a way to go about things that is technically correct for West Coast swing. And yes, it can look okay when you're using a different type of technique, but that doesn't mean that it's functionally going to work well. And I think that is I feel like that kind of goes hand in hand, right? Quality of movement is something that you kind of need to have in order to make your West Coast swing really functional. And I think that that's such an important piece, right? Like if you don't have certain techniques in your, you know, toolbox, then your West Coast swing isn't functional. So it makes it harder for you, right? It's not like we're talking about this and saying like, oh, you know, it's just wrong. Like that's not what we're trying to get at. It's just there's certain aspects of technique that will fall under quality of movement that makes things easier for you, right? Like, and that I think is a missed piece because I know there's a whole thing about like, should we be so critical about technique? And it's like, well, no, but it's more like when you have better technique for our dance, it makes our dance easier for
and
you and for your partner. Right. Yeah. So it's not like we're just like bashing on anything just because, but there is like for physics, like there is things that make it easier. When you're doing incorrect technique, you tend to be kind of fighting the physics of it. Right. So it makes it harder. There's that kind of hand in hand of like quality of movement that is based in that technique. So it all makes it easier. And so when you're looking for quality of movement, you are really looking for, is this technique being done in a way that is the most helpful, the most in line with physics, I guess, for what we're trying to achieve.
Yep. And I feel like an experience that any West Coast swing dancer has at some point, if they've been in the community just long enough, they'll see someone new come in learning about our wonderful dance, but they will be coming from a different dance style, like you had mentioned earlier. And like ballroom is the one that comes to mind. Like you can always tell when a ballroom dancer is trying West Coast swing for the first time, because it's how they're carrying themselves. Their technique is different because they're coming from a different dance background. And that kind of eye for difference in technique, how clear the distinction is. More advanced dancers and the pros, and Alicia and I, this is why we do this nerdy West Coast swing, is because we have that ability to see the distinction at the really higher levels, where we'll be seeing like a brilliant dancer dancing, and others might see that as West Coast swing, but it's as jarring to us as watching a ballroom dancer come and do West Coast swing for the first time. And so we want to empower everyone to have the eye to see those distinctions, and then make choices for yourself based on the dance that you want to dance. Because at the end of the day, we want you to have more fun, and we want you to be able to look how you want to look, regardless of what the powers that be say you should look like, because that's continually going to change. And if you want to dance in line with what others want to see, like judges, for example, that is achievable. But if you want to dance and look different because you have different values about what you want to look like, if you want to look more like a classic swing dancer, that is also available to you. So it's about empowering everyone to have the eye and to learn the technique, so that way you can make those distinctions and decisions for yourself.
Talking about kind of that range of technique that it falls under the category of West Coast swing, there's that range that like it's quality of movement, but then also you want to take into account like each person's own bodies. Like not everyone's bodies works the same way. So like you might have to do something slightly differently than somebody else, but you can do it in a way that achieves the same goal that you're, going for by doing this certain thing, because there's certain instructors that will teach you to do something a certain way. And there's nothing wrong with that. It can be correct, but it also might not work for your body specifically. So one of those things of like looking at the quality of movement is looking at like, what is the goal of this particular thing that I'm being told to do? How can I adjust this to have the same thing happen, but in a slightly different way? And so when you're looking at like quality of movement, there's that range, like where it's achieving the proper thing and it works on your body. And so being able to look at that is something really important. And that quality of movement, I think that's where that comes into play, because it, as long as it's something that you are controlling and that you are intentionally doing, and you are doing in a way that achieves something that is swing related, then that's something that falls under that category of quality of movement. And as a dancer, as a instructor, you should be able to look at somebody's dancing and say, like, here's the different pieces that I'm seeing. They're achieving the thing that they should be achieving. I see that they're doing this specific thing because of, they're wanting to do this, and it looks a little different, but they're doing it intentionally. It's controlled well, and it's achieving the goal. So quality of movement wise, thumbs up, right?
That actually really reminds me, in the earlier years of Swingcouver, they had these wonderful follow styling workshop and leader styling workshops at like the same time on Sunday morning. And the cool thing, it would be like 4 or 5 of the pros teaching the same workshop. So you'd have like 5 of the top follows, each teaching their little section of technique or styling, for example, and it would be put together in a sequence. And then you get to see each one of them dance the whole sequence and see how the different styling looks on them based on their uniqueness and their technique. And that was so much fun. I also really enjoy that, like watching the routine-sive performances at Swingtacular, because a lot of the pros and all-stars also participate in that
Yeah.
great intensive. And for example, Roro and Mia did routine-sive this past August. And I really enjoyed watching them to see how they expressed that Jordan taught routine and how that movement looked on their bodies based on their technique. And it's just like really cool. That's one of the reasons why we love West Coast swing.
Yeah.
And so part of advancing your knowledge, just hammering it home, I've said it a few times, being really clear, is to like get to the point where you really understand what that range of correct technique is in West Coast swing.
Right.
So that way you can pick where in that range you want to fall, as opposed to kind of like blindly searching around in the dark for something on a wider spectrum that tends to be more acceptable these days because there's a lack of clarity. But that's in part the reason this dance can grow is because we're allowing it to. Like, I know Benji has refused to create a syllabus for like Arthur Murray or Fred Astaire or whatever that chain is, because that would lock West Coast swing into something like a picture, and it wouldn't be able to grow and change. And this is a dance that grows and changes with popular music very particularly. So it's important that we allow it to grow. We just need to make sure that we're encouraging that the correct technique is what's growing instead of weeds coming in from the sides.
Did we want to talk any more about the aesthetically pleasing aspect of it, or are we good?
Yeah, so like, and aesthetically pleasing is also where we can get into the point of bias, like really as an individual, especially like judges in competitions, where a lot of people will conflate the body with the movement. And because the body is aesthetically pleasing in a standard stereotypical way, therefore the movement is. Right. And we could spend an entire thing on that. Like, just because, for example, I'm in a much larger body and I have a lot more S curves to my profile or my head on, like, even though my leg is going to be straight, depending on the clothing I'm wearing, the line isn't necessarily, it's going to be wavy on the sides, right? So like, for example, I have the capacity to train and like copy someone else's dancing. Like, for example, if I were to do one of Emmeline Rochefoy's wonderful solo movement things, and if I spent a few months really literally copying her, if I did the exact same thing she did, people would still like what she did better because she is in a more stereotypically pleasing body. That's unfortunately just like how the world works right now. And I know there are people working to change that. But when we're talking about quality of movement, it's independent of the body that is doing the moving. It's the technique behind the movement. And like Alicia was saying it before, it's about having that control and being able to choose when and where you're placing different parts of your body in time and space. And this is where we're going to get into the details in part 2 for what that looks like. But it also includes things like lines and shapes. Lines and shapes are the result of the technique. That's right. Like, those are that's like the target for using a bow and arrow analogy. The line and the shape, that's a target, but the technique is actually, using the bow to shoot the arrow.
I want to add on to what you were saying, because you're talking about like if you spent a bunch of time mimicking exactly what Emmeline was doing. I want to talk about that a little bit because I think that's interesting. Because if you put time into copying exactly what she was doing, it would look different on you than it would on her. But in theory, you could spend that time, instead of figuring out exactly what she's doing in terms of technique, you could spend that time trying to mimic the look of what she's doing. And now it would look the same, but your technique would be totally different because you would have to be doing something totally different to achieve the same look. Right. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then at the end, just because I'm in a fat body, people might still not like it and say Emmeline is better. So
yeah,
gotta watch out for your biases, people.
Yeah. Yeah, but I just wanted to mention
Yeah,
that
that was
because
cool.
like
That
it's
was
you can,
juicy.
yeah, you can try and mimic the same thing. And that is, I think, a lot of what gets dancers in such a confusing state. Like when you've learned kind of like the basics, right? And you're trying to learn more things, right? You go and you take lessons, and a lot of what it is, hey, like try and mimic this, or you say like, well, you want this over here, and you try and mirror exactly what you're seeing. And yeah, technically you're doing the same thing, but in likelihood, unless you're working with somebody that has a very similar body type to you, what you're, mirroring probably is being done differently, and you're achieving it differently. So you're probably having to do more, put more work in order to achieve the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's making your West Coast swing a lot harder, a lot more exhausting physically and mentally because you're having to think about it more, right? In general, with good technique, you don't have to think about it too much. Your body kind of naturally falls into a lot of it once you know what it is. And it'll look a little different on everyone. But once you kind of know what it is you're trying to achieve, then it kind of naturally will flow, right? It's more of a relaxed feel than a lot of things. And I think that sometimes we get kind of almost stiff when we're trying to do this exact specific thing, do this exact technique in this exact way and make it look this exact same way as somebody else, right? And that's not what we should be trying to do. We should be trying to more relax and let our body flow into what it wants to do, but kind of guide it, but not like dictate every little inch of everything, I think that's
to like a simplified wrap up. The workflow that at least has worked better for us is to find the technique that feels good and then lean into how that looks on our body.
Yeah.
And tweak it, as opposed to picking how we want to look and then trying to find the technique that will get us there.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a recipe for madness.
It's a lot harder. Like it's a lot easier to find a technique that works for you and then kind of tweak it into something that you like than it is to start with, here's what I like. Let me figure out how to force my body into that. It's a lot harder to do it that way.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot more time and a lot more mental effort. So
it's so much work. I am speaking directly from experience here.
Yeah.
Like I learning leading, I did the technique that works for me. I've kind of figured it out on my own, do really well. Whereas I've been training so hard on my following for years, and I've only really been meeting my goals in my following because Alicia has been helping unbrainwash me from a whole bunch of like confusing feedback that doesn't mean anything.
And I want to add into that the feedback that you were getting wasn't necessarily incorrect, just incorrect for you.
Yes.
And what worked on your body didn't quite. They were wanting you to do something to achieve a certain thing, but the way that they were trying to tell you to go about it wasn't quite right for your body.
Bingo. Yeah.
Hopefully that all kind of makes sense when we're talking about like quality of movement. Like we're wanting to look at good technique that is functional, that is intentional. And that's what we mean when we're talking about quality of movement. Now, there's more specifics in terms of what is quality of movement for West Coast swing within patterns and such things like that. But just in general, when we're talking about quality of movement, it's, having that control over the body and doing it intentionally and doing it in a way that is functionally helpful.
Yep. And oh God, the thought just like left.
Oh, there it goes.
If we do a slow-mo playback, you will see the moment when it just bye.
It's like the last episode that I had.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to add something on to that. What was I going to say?
The brain fart fairy is visiting both of us tonight.
Yeah. It's like right there.